Okay, today we're going to be going over the male reproductive system. But before I start, I just want to emphasize that I do want you to know the difference between mitosis and meiosis. You can pick that up from one of the lecture videos that I did for lab, and of course I have notes to go along with that. I also want you to have a basic idea of what occurs during fertilization, when the sperm and egg get together to form the diploid zygote that then divides by mitosis to become the embryo, then through fetal development until you have a newborn kid. And do make sure that you know the male and female reproductive organs. So I do want you to know this information that I covered in lab for both lab and lecture tests. So we're going to be looking at the reproductive system, and what's interesting about the reproductive system is it's a system that is not essential to the life of an individual because a woman, for example, can have the ovaries and uterus removed. A guy can lose both testes, say as a result of an injury, and in either case the loss of the reproductive system isn't life-threatening to the individual. So the reproductive system is unusual in that it's a system that's designed to perpetuate our species in order to, make kids, so the human species continues from one generation to another. So we're going to begin by looking at the male reproductive system, and that's what I'll cover in this video, and then I'll make another video over the female reproductive system. So the male gonad is the testis. Plural would be testes, and the testes are in the scrotum. A gonad is a sex organ where meiosis occurs to make sex cells or gametes. So the testis is the site of spermatogenesis, which is the type of meiosis that occurs in guys and produces haploid flagellated sperm cells. Of course, these haploid cells have one member of each chromosome pair, or 23 chromosomes all total. Within the testes are cells called Leydig cells, also known as interstitial cells. They secrete the steroid hormone testosterone, which often on these poster boards I call testo. The testis is enclosed within a glistening white colored capsule made of dense connective tissue with a lot of collagen fibers called the tunica albuginea. So within the testes, the spermatogenic process that produces sperm cells occurs inside the testes within what are known as the seminiferous tubules. There's about 1,000 of these seminiferous tubules per testis, but whenever I draw the seminiferous tubules within the testes, I usually only draw like 2 or 3 or 4 just for the sake of simplicity. The seminiferous tubules are aligned with what are referred to as the germinal epithelial cells. And it's the germinal epithelial cells that are responsible for spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis, the process by which sperm are produced in the seminiferous tubules within the testes, starts at puberty, and that's going to be when a guy is somewhere in the 7th grade, maybe somewhere between the years of 10 through 12. It varies from one guy to another. Occasionally puberty is delayed on up into maybe the 9th grade, and spermatogenesis that starts at puberty continues throughout a male's life until they die. So, just a little bit about the male anatomy. This would be a testis inside the scrotum. And within the testis would be the seminiferous tubules. And the lumen of the seminiferous tubules is lined by epithelial cells known as the germinal epithelium. The seminiferous tubules serve as the site where spermatogenesis makes haploid sperm cells. The haploid sperm cells then move out of the lumen of the seminiferous tubule, where they are stored in a highly coiled tube that goes around the edge of the outside of the testis, called the epididymis. Between the seminiferous tubules are the Leydig cells. And the Leydig cells are the cells within the testes that make the steroid hormone, testosterone. Testosterone is secreted from the Leydig cells into the blood, and then it circulates throughout the body and has a number of effects that I'll talk about later. So this would be just a single seminiferous tubule, and the lumen of the seminiferous tubule would be lined with the germinal epithelial cells. The germinal epithelial cells are called diploid spermatogonia. Spermatogonium would be singular. Change the UM to an A and becomes plural. And the spermatogonia that make up the germinal epithelium, curiously enough, divide first by mitosis. And they produce two daughter cells. So this would be a spermatogonium dividing by mitosis to form two daughter cells. One of the daughter cells remains as a spermatogonium. In that way, the spermatogonia maintain themselves throughout the life of the male. So one of the two daughter cells from mitosis remains as a spermatogonium and component of the germinal epithelium. The other daughter cell is referred to as a primary spermatocyte. It too is a diploid cell, but it undergoes meiosis. And the type of meiosis that occurs is referred to as spermatogenesis. And the diploid primary spermatocyte that is created by the mitotic division of the spermatogonium then undergoes meiosis to produce the haploid sperm cells that ultimately move out of the seminiferous tubules into the epididymis, where the sperm cells are stored. So it's kind of interesting. The testes during embryogenesis, across the first 8 weeks of a pregnancy, form in the abdominal cavity. And they ultimately have to descend from the abdominal cavity through the inguinal canal into the scrotum. So each of the testes in the abdominal cavity are attached to a long connective tissue cord called the gubernaculum. And the gubernaculum runs from the scrotum through the inguinal canal and then attaches to the testis. Of course, whatever you see for one testis would be true of the other testis as well. 1 to 2 months before birth, the gubernaculum, this long cord, pulls each of the testes through the inguinal canal and then down into the scrotum. And this is called the descent of the testes, which occurs before a normal full-term birth. The reason the testes descend into the scrotum is because spermatogenesis produces viable sperm. And by viable, I mean capable of fertilizing an egg. Spermatogenesis produces viable sperm at temperatures that are somewhat lower than body temperature. So the optimal temperature for spermatogenesis is around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be 35 degrees Celsius. And that's several degrees lower than a normal body temperature of 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. There is a condition that occurs in about 30% of preemies. A preemie would be a little boy that's born prematurely, and occurs in about 3% of full-term male babies. In other words, kids that are born, at 9 months after a full-term pregnancy. And it's called cryptorchidism. So the word crypt means secret, and orchid means gonad. So cryptorchidism translates to secret gonad. And what happens is that when the kid is born, a delivering physician would palpate or feel the scrotum and make sure that both testes had descended. If one or both of the testes isn't in the scrotum at birth, then the kid is diagnosed with cryptorchidism. So cryptorchidism can be unilateral if only one testis descends, or bilateral if both do not descend. So generally what you do is simply wait after birth to see if the testes will descend on their own. And that's particularly the case with the preemie. If you find that after a while the testes don't descend on their own, then this condition of cryptorchidism can be surgically corrected. You want to surgically correct it because, again, spermatogenesis won't produce viable sperm if the testes remain in the abdominal cavity throughout life. There is a skeletal muscle embedded within the wall of the scrotum called the cremaster muscle. And I want you to know the name of this muscle. The cremaster muscle helps to regulate the temperature within the scrotum so that the temperature is optimal or close to optimal for the production of viable sperm by spermatogenesis. So this muscle contracts or relaxes in response to temperature change. So if the temperature around the scrotum is very cold, let's say it's a guy swimming in cold water, then the cremaster muscle will contract, and when it does, the scrotal sac shrinks up or retracts towards the body wall to keep the testes as close to the core temperature as possible and warm them up. On the other hand, if a guy exercises and gets really hot or sits in a hot tub, then the cremaster muscle in the wall of the scrotum relaxes and the scrotum literally becomes sort of a long droopy bag that takes the testes further away from the core temperature of the body, where presumably it would be cooler and closer to the optimal temperature for sperm production. Outside of the testes, but still in the scrotum, is a long tube called the epididymis. And there's one epididymis per testis. The epididymis outside of the testis is a storage tube for sperm. Sperm are capable of living in the epididymis, I say I misspelled epididymis there, for around 20 days, unless they are ejaculated during intercourse, something we'll talk about a little later. After about 20 days in the epididymis, the sperm start to deteriorate, and at that point they are phagocytized or eaten by cells living in the epididymis called macrophages. The epididymis straightens out into a long tube called the ductus deferens, also known as the vas deferens. And the ductus deferens is a tube that the sperm take out of the epididymis if a guy ejaculates semen during sexual intercourse. The ductus deferens joins with the duct coming out of the seminal vesicle to form a very short ejaculatory duct that goes through the prostate and then opens up into the urethra. There are several glands, collectively known as the accessory glands, that make a solution known as semen. Semen is a very thick or viscous, white-colored solution that forms in the urethra during sexual intercourse. Semen is the solution that's ejaculated or pumped out of the penis into the vagina as a way of transferring sperm from a guy's body into the female body. The pH of semen is alkaline at around 7.4. It has a range from 7.2 to 7.8, but on average it's somewhere around 7.4. So I'm going to list the contents of semen, and a typical male ejaculate of semen into the vagina would be around 3.5 mils. So if my finger were a test tube, then you probably would be able to fill it up to, I guess, around the first joint with 3 to 5 mils, just to give you a sense of the volume that I'm talking about. So within 3.5 mils or so of semen, you'd find sperm cells, and there are a staggering number of sperm cells in the typical male ejaculate, probably upwards of 300 million. That's about 50 million or so, say, per mil. In addition, semen contains the secretions of 3 accessory glands. And they would include the seminal vesicles, and there's 2 seminal vesicles, and I'll abbreviate seminal vesicle SV, 1 prostate gland, and I'll abbreviate that with a P, and 2 glands known as the bulbourethral glands. So sperm and solutions from these glands together make up what's called semen. The pH of semen is important because of the acidity of the vaginal fluids. So it turns out that there are resident bacteria that live in the vagina and they secrete acids. As a result, the pH of the vaginal fluids is somewhere around 4.5. That's a pH at which sperm do not swim well. So if you have a solution with a pH of around 4.5 and you put sperm cells in that solution, then you find that the sperm swim very sluggishly and often go around in circles. As a result, it's necessary to adjust that pH upwards to a pH of 6, which is the optimal pH at which sperm swim the best. So it turns out that at a pH of 6, the sperm swim in a straight line. That's called tracking, and they swim very vigorously. So when the semen with a pH of 7.4 mixes with fluids in the vagina, the pH is adjusted upward from 4.5 to 6. We could spend a whole course on the reproductive system and dig down in detail about all of these glands and chemicals associated with them and what they contribute. But we're just going to talk about a couple things. So, we'll look first at the seminal vesicles. The seminal vesicles provide about 70% of the volume of semen, so obviously that's the bulk of it. And the pH of the seminal vesicle solution of 7.4 is the main contributor to the pH of semen. And a solution with a pH of 7.4 is important because when it mixes with the vaginal fluids, it will buffer the acidity of the fluids in the vagina, bringing the pH up from 4.5 to a pH of 6, which is the optimal pH at which sperm swim the best. So, seminal vesicles include nutrients that sperm take up, and that helps to nourish the sperm cells. One of the nutrients that I want you to know is fructose. So fructose is a simple sugar or monosaccharide, and it's found in the solution secreted by the seminal vesicles, hence it's found in semen. And sperm take up the fructose and then convert it to glucose, and then use the glucose to make ATP by cellular respiration. So it turns out that the whipping of the flagellum of a sperm cell back and forth is an ATP-dependent process. And sperm cells need a lot of glucose as a fuel substrate in order to make ATP. Not surprising, sperm contain a fairly large number, I guess, of mitochondria, considering how small they are as cells. There are 2 seminal vesicles, but only 1 prostate gland. And the prostate gland, hopefully as you know, after looking at the male reproductive structures in the lab video, is found right beneath the urinary bladder. The ejaculatory ducts go through the prostate gland and open into the urethra. So the prostate gland is found beneath the urinary bladder. And the prostate gland solution has a pH of 6.5, which is significantly higher than the pH of the vaginal fluids. And so it too helps to neutralize the acidity of the fluids found in the vagina when semen is ejaculated into the vagina during sexual intercourse. Lastly, there are a pair of glands known as the bulbourethral glands, and they secrete a kind of slimy mucus-containing solution into the urethra, and that helps to lubricate the walls of the urethra, or make them kind of slippery. It'd be if you had some kind of oil and sort of pasted it against the walls. And this lubrication helps the semen to slip and slide its way easily out of the urethra during ejaculation. Okay, just a little bit about the penis. The penis actually is a component of 2 systems in guys. It's part of the reproductive system, where it serves as what's referred to as a copulatory organ. Copulation is just another word for sexual intercourse. During sexual intercourse, an erect penis, and we'll talk about erection in a little while, inserts into the vagina and serves as a conduit for transferring haploid sperm, which are in the semen, into the vagina of the female. So in a way, this is sort of the bridge that allows for the transfer of sperm to the female body. The penis is also a component of the urinary system. and the urinary bladder is drained by the urethra, which runs the length of the penis. So I don't want you to forget about the erectile columns, and I talked about those in the lab video. And there would be two of the corpora cavernosa and a single corpus spongiosum that the urethra goes through. So the urethra is a tube that allows guys to pass urine to the outside of the body. It's also the same tube that semen is ejaculated from. So there's one opening at the end of the penis, and that opening is the urethral orifice. When males have sex with a female, they undergo 3 phases that together form what's called the male sexual response. Note that each of these phases begins with the letter E. The first phase is erection, next comes emission, and then finally ejaculation. And we'll talk about each of these phases in turn, beginning with phase 1, or erection. So the penis of a guy is generally flaccid, where the term flaccid means limp, like a wet spaghetti noodle. And the penis must go from a flaccid or limp state to a stiff rod. And that transformation is called an erection. So it turns out that the glans or head of the penis is densely innervated with fine touch receptors. And that means the head of the penis is very, very sensitive to touch. So it turns out that physical stimulation to the glans, or head of the penis, where these fine touch receptors are found, triggers a reflex that results in an increase in the flow of blood into the erectile columns. And as the erectile columns in the penis fill with blood, the penis is transformed from a flaccid state with an average length of about 3.5 inches to a stiff rod, maybe 5 or 6 inches long. The penis must transform into a stiff, hard rod in order for it to insert into the vagina to begin sexual intercourse. It is not possible to push a flaccid penis into the vagina. So there's a condition that I wanted to tell you about before we move on to phase 2, or emission, called impotence. Impotence is also referred to as erectile dysfunction. And impotence is failure of a guy to have an erection. The result is that the penis, unless it can transform into a stiff rod, cannot insert into the vagina. And an impotent guy then can't engage in sexual intercourse. So there are several causes that can lead to impotence. Some of them are psychological. So sometimes if a male has a lot of anxiety about having sex, this can inhibit the ability to have an erection, and sometimes that requires some trips to a sex therapist. In some cases, the cause of impotence is physiological as a result of atherosclerosis or nerve damage, or there's a couple other things that can cause impotence. And then you're looking for, a different kind of solution. Okay, we're going to move on next to emission, or phase 2. So emission requires continued stimulation to the glands of the penis, and that occurs as the penis goes back and forth in the vagina. So it turns out that there are ridges called rugae, same name we saw in the stomach, that line the vagina. And the penis going back and forth against these ridges, or rugae, generates friction against the glands of the penis that stimulates the sensory receptors and leads to, after a while, this phase called emission. So, when emission occurs at some point within a couple having sexual intercourse, then there are peristaltic contractions that kick in the guy of smooth muscle in the walls of the following. So you have smooth muscle contractions that occur in the epididymis, and that's going to push sperm cells out of the epididymis into the ductus deferens or vas deferens. There are smooth muscle contractions that occur in the ductus deferens that continue to move the sperm up to the ejaculatory duct and finally into the urethra. There are smooth muscle contractions that occur in the wall of the seminal vesicle, and it secretes its solution into the seminal vesicle duct, to the ejaculatory duct, and then into the urethra. In addition, there are smooth muscle contractions that occur in the walls of the prostate and bulbourethral glands, and they secrete their solutions into the urethra as well. So the result of all this is that you get sperm and the solutions from the accessory glands mixing together in the urethra during emission. In other words, semen forms in the urethra as a result of emission. So I want you to just file away the fact that males are not aware that emission is occurring and that semen is accumulating in the urethra. The third and last phase of the male sexual response that begins with an erection. Sex continues for a while until emission occurs, and after emission, ejaculation occurs. If a guy, for whatever reason, stops having sex after the emission phase, then he will not proceed to ejaculation. So in a way, you kind of imagine a couple having sex, emission occurs, semen forms in the urethra, and I don't know, the baby cries, and mom has to get up and go and attend to the baby, and it stays there for several hours. If a guy has semen that forms during emission, but sex doesn't continue, then the semen ultimately would be washed out of the urethra the next time he urinates. But we're going to assume that after the semen forms during emission, that this couple continues to have sex and there's continued stimulation to the glands of the penis, which leads to ejaculation. So, soon after emission, with continued stimulation to the penis, skeletal muscles at the base of the penis contract forcefully. And there are, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 contractions. So these muscles will contract and relax and contract and relax and contract and relax. And a male is aware of every single one of these contractions. He feels them all. And the idea is that as the skeletal muscle at the base of the penis contracts, the contractions will press down on the urethra and act to pump or move semen out of the urethra and into the vagina. So I want to emphasize that males feel each one of these skeletal contractions. It's kind of interesting, but every time a male ejaculates semen into the vagina, he experiences what's known as an orgasm, sometimes referred to as a sexual climax. And the orgasm refers to intense feelings of pleasure that a male has for not very long, like 10 to 15 seconds, every time he ejaculates semen. before we leave the male sexual response, I wanted to just talk a little bit about withdrawal. Later on we'll talk about some birth control methods. But withdrawal is actually a form of birth control with a relatively low success rate. And withdrawal is the reason behind unwanted pregnancies that happen particularly among teenagers. So, we're assuming that we have a couple having sex, and they're having what's called unprotected sex. And that means that the guy is not wearing a condom, and the female is not taking birth control pills or using an intrauterine device or IUD. So neither one of the neither one are using any kind of protection against an unwanted pregnancy. So what happens with withdrawal is that during sex, semen forms in the urethra during emission. The guy's not aware that that's occurring. But what happens is that at some point in time, the skeletal muscle at the base of the penis starts to contract and relax, 7, 8 times or so. And a guy keys the withdrawal of his penis from the vagina when he feels the first skeletal muscle contraction that he knows is going to lead to ejaculation. And of course the hope is that he gets out or withdraws before he ejaculates any semen into the vagina. If he doesn't withdraw quick enough and ejaculates even a small drop of semen, that's probably going to be enough sperm to get a female pregnant. So there are about 50 million sperm cells in every milliliter of semen. So I say I wrote sperm there, but I meant to write semen. And keep in mind, it only takes one sperm to actually fertilize an egg. So we're going to move on and talk about the male reproductive hormones. And there's 3 of these hormones that I'll talk about. FSH, LH, and testosterone. FSH and LH together are known as gonadotropins. So there are the gonadotropin hormones, FSH and LH. Gonado is, gonad for sex organ, or the organs where meiosis produces the gametes, and the term tropin means to stimulate. So FSH and LH are peptide hormones made of amino acids that stimulate the gonads, in this case the male gonad or the testis. So the gonadotropins FSH and LH are secreted by the pituitary gland. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the pituitary gland. Some of this should be a review from last semester when we talked about the nervous system. So the brain consists of 4 regions: cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The diencephalon, in turn, consists of primarily the thalamic lobes and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So this would be the hypothalamus of the diencephalon, and hanging from the hypothalamus by a stalk known as the infundibulum or pituitary stalk is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has a front part and a back part. So if this were your eye and your nose and your mouth, or the front of the body, then the front portion of the pituitary gland is known as the anterior pituitary. And the back portion of the pituitary gland is known as the posterior pituitary. So FSH and LH, the gonadotropins, are released from cells in the anterior part of the pituitary or the anterior pituitary. And FSH and LH are secreted from cells of the anterior part of the pituitary gland into the blood, where the blood carries them to the testes, and they have effects on the testes, which would be their target organ. So FSH and LH secretion, curiously enough, begins at puberty. And puberty is the time in a guy and a girl's life when they undergo a variety of physical changes that are very obvious. So puberty is going to be somewhere around the 7th grade, when a guy is somewhere, between the ages of 10 to 12. So it might occur in 6th grade or 8th grade, but generally this is going on with 7th graders. And the FSH that's secreted, beginning at puberty, will stimulate spermatogenesis to occur in the seminiferous tubules. And that means that this is a guy who's making sperm cells, and as a result could father a child. And the LH from the pituitary gland stimulates the Leydig cells in the testes to secrete testosterone into the blood. So let me tell you a little bit about testosterone. Testosterone is a steroid hormone secreted by the Leydig cells, and that begins at puberty, generally somewhere when a kid is in the 7th grade. The secretion of testosterone from the Leydig cells continues throughout life until the guy dies. Testosterone is a steroid hormone, and all steroid hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone are synthesized from cholesterol. So cholesterol is acted upon by enzymes and converted to testosterone. And this occurs in the Leydig cells within the testes. So we're going to find that as we talk about male and female, that testosterone is what's known as the masculinizing hormone, and estrogen is known as a feminizing hormone. So when you look at guys and girls, there's obvious differences. Girls have more of that hourglass shape that we don't see in guys. Obviously guys can outcompete females in sports generally because guys have more muscle mass. So they can lift more weight, they can run faster, and these are physical differences between male and female that again are pretty obvious, and we really start to see take shape around the time of the middle school years. So guys and girls kind of look similar up until middle school, but certainly through middle school and by 9th grade the differences between male and female are pretty darn obvious. So a little bit about some of the effects that testosterone has on the male body. And these are effects that begin at puberty, when LH is released from the pituitary gland and starts to stimulate the Leydig cells to secrete testosterone for the first time in adult quantities. Testosterone has some really dramatic effects on the male body that we refer to as masculinizing effects. So, first, testosterone will stimulate what's sometimes referred to as the male pattern of hair growth. And that generally means that because of the testo in guys from the testes, males are just hairier everywhere as compared to females. So males have more hair on their face, on their chest, on their legs, on their arms, in the pubic region. And that is a testo effect difference that we see phenotypically, or the way we look, between the guys and the girls. Testosterone, we've talked about this before, will increase the size of the larynx and thicken up the vocal cords. And the result of testosterone's effect on changing the larynx is that a male finds the voice deepening during puberty. So a male voice up until puberty can be pretty much at the same pitch, kind of higher than a female, but certainly by 9th grade, I think everybody has noticed that the male voice is deeper as compared to a female voice. So, several more testosterone effects, just to continue. Testosterone will stimulate the release of erythropoietin from kidney cells, and that in turn stimulates erythropoiesis. That's the hematopoietic process that leads to red blood cell production. And because of this effect of testo to augment the release of EPO from the kidneys, guys have more erythropoiesis occurring in the red bone marrow, and as a result have higher circulating numbers of red blood cells. Now if you look at all of the blood combined, you're looking at 4 or 5 liters, guys have trillions more red cells as compared to females, which gives them an oxygen carrying advantage, and we see that played out in endurance sports like cross country, running, long distance bicycling, endurance events. So males on average have about 5.5 million red blood cells per microliter, whereas females have maybe 4.5 million red cells per microliter. Okay, another effect of testosterone is to increase the activity of the oil glands or sebaceous glands in the skin. Sebaceous glands can get infected, and when they do, you get acne. So the greater activity of sebaceous glands in males generally means that males battle acne more than females. And of course this battle begins when testo secretion begins at puberty, and certainly we see quite a bit of that through the rest of the teenage years. Another effect of testosterone is to stimulate the synthesis of contractile proteins in the skeletal muscle. So by contractile proteins, I mean proteins like actin and myosin that make up the myofilaments that together form the myofibrils or contractile rods that we see inside skeletal muscle cells. So the testo effect increases the number of myofibrils, or their density, and that makes the diameter of the skeletal muscle cells larger, and guys on average have more muscle mass and are stronger as compared to females. So guys are more likely to lift more weight, in a gym, and this is a real physical advantage that males have over females. Another effect of testosterone is to increase the sex drive. So surveys show that males think about sex more often than females. This is well known. And if you surgically castrate a dog, and that means take out or cut out both testes and literally throw them away, then that dog becomes less sexually aggressive. And lastly, another testosterone effect is to increase the basal metabolic rate, or the number of reactions that occur within the cells of the body per minute. So testosterone will increase the basal metabolic rate, which means that guys have a slightly higher metabolism generally as compared to females, and guys tend to burn off fuel substrates that contribute to weight, to include glucose, in order to make the ATP to support a higher level of cell activity. And that helps guys control their weight in ways that wouldn't occur or occur as easily in females. So lastly, I'll tell you a little bit about vasectomy. Vasectomy is a male sterilization procedure. A sterile male is one who cannot father a child. So vasectomy is a relatively simple operation. It takes maybe 30 minutes. It's done on what's called an outpatient basis. In other words, you don't have to go to a hospital. Sometimes it's done by a urologist. So Females have, a special doctor who specializes in the female reproductive system. They go to see, an OB/GYN. There's really no parallel for that among guys, because guys don't make a trip to some special doctor, every year to, have their reproductive organs, kind of looked at. So often a urologist who specializes in the urinary system also does vasectomies. The vasectomies are done under a local anesthetic in order to numb the scrotal area. So what happens during a vasectomy is that a couple cuts are made in the scrotum, and the physician then goes in and cuts out a section of the vas deferens and seals off the ends of the cut ends. So the result is that a male is sterilized because sperm can't incorporate into semen. And after a vasectomy, the sperm count in semen should be 0. So it turns out that after a vasectomy, sperm are still produced in the seminiferous tubules because there was no damage done to the testes. And the sperm that are produced after a vasectomy are still stored in the epididymis. After a vasectomy, because the Leydig cells aren't damaged, the Leydig cells within the testes continue to produce testosterone. And after a vasectomy, all the accessory glands are still intact and they're still fine, and they will make their solutions that contribute to the formation of semen in the urethra. So after a vasectomy, a guy can have sex, get an erection, insert the penis into the vagina. After continued stimulation, a guy moves into emission. And during emission, the peristaltic contractions in the wall of the epididymis move sperm out into the vas deferens, but the sperm cannot get past this point. And as a result, they don't end up in semen. But a male still forms semen after a vasectomy. And the bulk of semen comes from the solution secreted by the accessory glands. So the accessory glands continue to secrete their solutions after a vasectomy, and the solutions accumulate as semen in the urethra, but there's no sperm. And the semen then would be ejaculated in the vagina. And without sperm, it's not possible to get a girl pregnant.